All right, guys, welcome to today's lesson in our next segment in our series of video notes. And today we're going to take a look at the market revolution. And we're talking about the time period around 1850 to 1850 and really getting ourselves up into the pre-Civil War antebellum period. And we're going to see kind of how does the market shift, how does the American economy change, and how does this lead to this idea of sectionalism of North versus South, versus West. So if we take a look here at our first essential question for the day, we're going to kind of go back to what we talked about with Henry Clay in our last discussion and see how did his American system lead to a national market economy, and how did the North and South and West all kind of tie in together and help each other's economies grow in much different ways. So first, make sure we know this key term, the antebellum period, this 1800 to 1840 time period, really pre-Civil War period. And in this antebellum period, the U.S. economy is going to grow very, very quickly. Each the South, North, and West have become specialized. They have their own section of economies. While the West is growing and expanding, the North is going to focus on industry, while the South focuses on cash crops, while the West focuses on farming for and feeding the rest of the nation. And again, we talked about this last time to kind of describe how Henry Clay was able to use this as far as building roads and canals in order to make it work. So let's focus on the South first, and let's take a look at here what technology changed the South. As we can see here, hopefully we know what this is. Right, we should know this is the cotton gin. It takes the raw cotton and you crank it, and it takes the seeds and pulls it out, and you eventually have clean cotton. And what this does, it allows for the focus of the Southern economy to be in cotton and to really focus on growing as much cotton as possible. So if you are a southern farmer, you're becoming very profitable from this cash crop. So if this cash crop is giving you profit, how are you going to make more profit? You're going to make more cotton. And if you're going to do that, it's going to have an impact on the South by increasing drastically the slave population. And we can see here in the two maps between 1820 and 1860 that the slave population expands very, very quickly. So Eli Whitney is definitely somebody that we want to know as far as inventing the cotton gin, and then again the effect that the cotton gin has on the South that allows cotton to be made very, very easy at a low labor cost and is able to make profit for the southern plantations. And it becomes so much so that it's going to earn the name King Cotton, and the Deep South is actually going to produce almost 75% of the world's cotton exports. And this is going to help the industry of the North. It's going to allow for northern textile mills. We'll talk about Lowell girls who are working in these labor factories that were able to take the cotton and make finished goods with. So it's going to become very, very profitable for the South, and that's why the South's industry will mostly be based on cotton and other cash crops. And this increase in cotton production, or this king cotton, is not only going to have impacts or effects in the South as far as an increase in slavery, it's also going to impact the movement westward, because as people are going to want to branch out and able to produce and find more farmland to produce more cash crops on, the need for slavery to move out westward is also going to become an issue, which is where we got into the argument of the 1820 Compromise, where Missouri will become a slave state and also Maine will become a free state. And you can see the demographics here that as we move farther westward and as we continue advancing in society as far as the labor movement in the South and with the cotton, some states like South Carolina, you have more slaves than you do even free whites. So there's a huge increase for the need of slaves as we move out westward with all of these southern states where slavery is legal. And this graph will show a good representation as far as to see why King Cotton, or why cotton was king in the South's labor pool. It was making up over half of all slave labor. And we can see some of the smaller margins, whether it is housework or tobacco or rice or sugar. And these are all very tedious, laborious plants as far as tobacco and sugar and rice or so. So when the cotton gin becomes or makes for the cotton industry to become so much easier, most farming and most cash cropping is going to be geared towards cotton because you can produce so much more of it now with the cotton gin. Now, it's important to keep in mind too is we always tend to think of the South as everybody was this racist white slave owner, and that's just not the case. And in fact, 76%, over 75% of Southerners were not slave owners. Okay, and most people of the South who did not own slaves actually hated slavery because it made them that much harder to find work. Because if I'm a farmer and I do have slaves, I don't have to pay them, so I'm not going to hire a free white to do the job for me. So it actually hinders the South's ability to rise economically because of slavery. So most Southerners did not own slaves, but we can see where the majority of slaves only had about one. It wasn't this huge plantation culture. That was a small part of it, but most had a handful of slaves. Most were not like the Thomas Jeffersons of the world who had hundreds of slaves, or George Washington who had 100 slaves, and so to their estate. And of course, we know that with this idea of slavery, or with the plantation culture, came the brutality of slavery and the torture of slaves in order to keep them competent or able to keep them in line, whether it was using muzzles or chains, having ID tags, keeping them similar to prisons, breeding to make sure that they would reproduce correctly for the plantation owner, using irons, branding, so like cattle, to make sure that they were part of the correct plantation, and just lavish beatings to make sure that they did not fight back or rebel, like we had seen with the Stono Rebellion during the colonial times. All right, so the next section here we're going to take a look at is the North, and we're going to take a look here at the technology that is going to rapidly change the North. So we talked about the South with the cotton gin. Interchangeable parts is going to be vital for the northern economy, because the northern economy is going to be based around industry and in factories. And if you are a factory owner, or if you are some sort of industry worker, it's a lot easier, becomes easier to make products with interchangeable parts. And you can see here a rifle, and it's broken up into dozens and dozens of different parts. And the benefit to this is, let's say that you do have a rifle, and one of the parts, the barrel or the stock, breaks. Okay, instead of having to replace the entire gun, which is a very tedious and very costly option, you can just take the stock off, put a new stock on, and now you have your same gun. It's a lot cheaper and more cost efficient. Same thing when it comes to assembling. Now, instead of having to have one gunsmith who knows how to make every single little part of the gun, I can use a factory system where each person maybe does one or two parts, and I can pay them less, and it becomes more and more efficient. Very similar to what we'll talk about the assembly line under Henry Ford, in order to keep the price of the first automobiles lower, so then I can sell more of them because more people can afford to buy my rifle. So the focus again is going to be on industry with the water loom system, with the power, and then we'll eventually get to the steam engine systems of the factories, and these are going to allow for textiles to be reproduced at a very, very high rate using the cotton from the South, and it's going to allow for the economies of the North to be infinitely times stronger than the economies of the South. So Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts will lead to an industrial revolution in the North, and with this industrial revolution we see huge amounts of migration movements and urbanization, people moving towards the cities, and shifting of jobs. People will leave the agricultural sector and move into the industrial sector, and it's changing the landscapes of the way people live. And you can see here some of the examples, whether it's the power loom, the sewing machine, spinning mule. All these are being used in the factory setting in the textile industry to create clothing at a much faster and cheaper rate. So with this 1790s with Samuel Slater, the first ever textile factories that were created, and you can see here using the water loom, or using the power of running water, flowing water to be able to operate the factories, is going to drastically migrate throughout New England and change the landscape of the New England economy. And one of the most famous examples of this will be the Lowell mills in Boston and throughout Massachusetts. And the way the Lowell mill worked is that they would find girls, teenage girls about the same age as you, and of our class, and they would find these girls that would want to work in these boarding house structures. So think of it kind of like living at college. You live in a dorm, you go to class, and then you stay in your dorm at night. That's basically what these girls are doing. They're living in these dorms, they're going to work in the factories, and then they're going back to their dorms at night. So you're living at your job. Now, this Lowell system, it did not pay much, but it gave these young girls a chance to make money that they did not typically have in the past. And a lot of these girls were using them to make dowries for themselves for when they became eventually married. So then with the new factory systems, it's going to change the way that the North's economy works again. They're going to start creating finished goods that can be used for farming equipment, textiles, etc. And it's going to lead to an increase in urbanization where large cities are going to be all up and down the East Coast, especially in the New England states. And also we'll see a few in the West, and you can see the drastic changes here from 1820 to 1860 at the height or the start of the Civil War, where you have major cities all on the East Coast, whether it be New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and even moving out west, whether it is Chicago, St. Louis, or New Orleans, now with the transportation boom and allowing for canals and rivers to be able to migrate trafficking to get products to the West Coast as well. With these new sets of jobs, then, we're seeing a ton of immigrants coming in from Ireland, from Germany. Millions are going to migrate in this 1840s time period because of the desire for jobs that cannot be found in Europe as overpopulation and starvation start happening. And they're looking for a better way of life, getting out of that feudal structure of Europe, finding a way to have a better life for them and their families. And even though they are low-paying jobs in New England or in the major cities, some will move out west to become farmers. And this increase in immigration is going to rise to this rapid idea of nativism, or trying to keep out immigrants and allow the jobs to go to native-born Americans or people who have been there for generations. And there was a growing number of fears that were happening here with the native societies, where they were believing that these poor immigrants coming over from Europe would not assimilate correctly. They would not actually become American. They would become a social burden that they'd have to be paid for and taken care of by Americans. That these Catholic immigrants coming over from Eastern Europe or Western Europe are going to remain loyal to the Pope rather than remaining loyal to the country. And they really do not want, they want to halt or kind of slow down the immigration process. And with this Know-Nothing Party will form in the 1850s prior to the Civil War as a way to restrict those immigrants coming over and try to keep immigrants out of the new nation and try to encourage this nativist populism in order to hire Americans in industry jobs. All right, so the last economy here, or the last region of the United States we're going to take a look at is the West. And if we look at the picture here and we take a look at what technology changed the West, we're going to see that new farming materials like the steel plow, like the reaper, are going to allow for large amounts of farming to be done on small areas of land. So the focus of the Western economy is going to be on crops. States like Illinois, Indiana, Iowa eventually are going to become the breadbasket states of the country and allow for, and even still today, it has a huge farming culture in these states because of this 1840s time period. And the impact this is going to have is going to be a mass migration out westward. And we can see here in the maps, you can look at the demographics here on the graph, that Tennessee and Kentucky double, triple their population in just the span of 10 years, because with massive urbanization, people are moving then out westward to find their own space, find their own land, and get away from that factory culture that is developing in the north. So with this population growth, it leads to a number of rapid opportunities in the West for farming. And because of these large-scale population or large-scale farming, equipments like John Deere's steel plow is going to make farming a lot more efficient and a lot less time-consuming or labor-intensive than it has been in the past. And these western states, or today's Midwest states, like we mentioned before, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, will become known as the America's breadbasket, where crops like corn and wheat, animals are going to be used to feed the rest of the nation.